Yeah, that's not on for some reason. Okay, go run the other mic back there. See if it's working, Pat. Yeah, we have, Houston, we have a problem. How many Baptists does it take to get a microphone working?
2. We're hot. Ooh, we're really hot.
That one's hot.
Yeah,
all right,
it's
go.
hot.
State
My
church.
understanding is that the fact that you have a state-run dictates the policy. They tell the church what they can and cannot do. In many cases, there may be only one religion that they sponsor. For example, I'm a Huguenot descendant, and the Huguenots were not allowed to practice their religion because the Catholic Church was the state church, and they went as far as to kill 10,000 or more Huguenots because they would not allow them to believe what they believed.
So if we have a state-run church or religion, that is going to affect let me go back a little bit here. You probably know which one. It's going to affect individual soul liberty, isn't it? Because if there is a state-operated church or religion, if it's run by the government, in most cases, you have to belong to that particular religion or church in the case of Christianity. And sometimes, we say, oh, well, that would be good. We make everybody a Christian, right? That's what happened with the Roman Empire when they made Christianity the state religion back several hundred years ago, about the 4th century. Let me mention a few things here that I had studied with regard to this. If I can get the right order, probably I think you mentioned it, Maureen, about Morocco. Probably the biggest example of a state religion is Islam. Sharia law. You ever heard of that? Sharia law is the Muslim Islamic law. It's the moral and legal framework of imposing Islam on everybody in a particular country. It's based on the Quran. It's based on what's called the Hadith. Have you ever heard of that? That Hadith is the sayings and actions of Muhammad, the prophet, the Islamic prophet. So the Quran and the Hadith. We'll probably have a Wednesday night study on Islam in light of the Bible because of all that's going on in our country. But when you have a country that is controlled by the Islamic religion and they impose Sharia law, it aims to direct every part of a person's public and private life. Sharia law in a Muslim country covers personal hygiene, diet, prayer, family matters, business, and criminal justice. Governments that fully adopt Sharia regulate social behavior and public morality through the power of the state. Now, some of the downside of that, traditional interpretations of Sharia often grant men more rights than women. Ladies, you ought to take note of that. Regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, owning property, etc. Laws against apostasy, that is leaving the religion, and blasphemy, that means insulting the religion, restrict open debate and free expression, and certainly individual soul liberty. And then non-Muslims living under strict traditional Sharia law often experience limited legal equality and, of course, limited religious freedom. In other words, if in the case of Islam, in the case of a Muslim country that dictates everybody in our country is going to be a Muslim if you're a citizen of this country. Well, that's a perfect example of a state religion. But then I mentioned earlier about this is the same thing the Roman Catholic Church did when the Emperor Constantine declared that everybody in the Roman Empire are now Christians. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? I mean, if you just declare, I mean, if I was elected president and I said, all right, I'm making an executive order. By the way, would y'all vote for me if I ran? A couple of you would. I'm going to make an executive order. Everybody in America are now Baptist. Would that make anybody a Baptist?
No.
Well, that's what happened in about AD 313, 314, when Emperor Constantine began Christianity's conversion to the imperial Roman religion. And there's a lot, we'll get into that when we talk about the history of how that happened. But one of the things I read in a particular book about the idea when the Emperor of Rome declared by decree that everybody in the Roman Empire are now Christians, and it is now the state religion, and we're getting rid of all the paganism, and we're all going to be quote-unquote Christians. Here's what one writer said. The first Romans to feel the negative effect of Constantine's new religious allegiance, in short, the ones who feel the negative effect were other Christians. Because when there were true believers, like Baptistic believers back in the Middle Ages, when they said, we don't believe that the church should be welded together with the imperial state government, they were immediately persecuted, ostracized. They were exiled. They were outlawed. And their books were burned. And then shortly after that, they began to be burned because they did not conform to the state religion. Do you see the problem with it? Well, we as Baptists have already, have for years, distanced ourselves from that. In fact, after the Roman Empire was subjected to, or the Roman Catholic Church was subjected to the Reformation. What's the Reformation? You ever heard that term? All right, somebody explain what the Reformation is, because some of you may not have a good grasp of that. What's the Reformation? All right, Alex, back behind you here, Pat. You're going to get a workout tonight, because I'm going to get some feedback. The Roman Catholic Church stayed the state religion across all of Europe for hundreds of years until the Reformation took place. So what's the Reformation? Yeah, we still got problems with the mic. All right,
Okay.
now it's working.
How about
I hear
now?
it.
Okay. In the early 1500s, Luther came along. He was a Roman Catholic monk. Luther got a hold of a Bible and started reading it secretly. And he found out that the Bible teaches a whole lot of different stuff than what the Roman Catholic Church taught. The Catholic Church talked about purgatory and all those things. At the same time, in Rome, the Catholics were building St. Peter's. And so they were gouging the people for money, and they were taking it off the poor. So Luther got to see all of that, plus he got to see some of the orgies and stuff that were taking place in Rome. So Luther wanted to reform the church. He wanted to bring them back to their basic biblical roots. And so he would post it in a document called the 95 Theses. It had 95 articles that were pointed at trying to bring the church back or to reform the church and bring it back, which all that did was make the church upset, and they sought to kill Luther. Luther ended up being protected by the German nobility at the time, and he was able to live and get a church started, which started this whole Reformation. Other churches started following and started generating as a result of Luther, as they looked at the Bible and said, the Bible says this, it's not what the Roman Catholic Church was trying to teach.
So the Roman Church had all kinds of false teachings that were not found in the Bible. Again, when we do the history in a couple of weeks, we'll see that when we get to that part of it. So, but they have a monopoly on all the countries of Europe, and they are dictating to them until some things happen where Martin Luther and some others began to want to reform the Catholic Church. That was their first intention, to reform the Catholic Church. That's where we get the term Reformation. What does reform mean? We just want to make it better. We just want to make it better. But then it came to the point where they realized the Catholic Church is not going to cooperate with being reformed, and so they began to protest against the Catholic Church. That's where we get the term Protestant. They were protesters against the Catholic Church, and so many of them broke out of the Catholic Church and established their own churches. Luther established what we know today as the Lutheran Church. The Calvinistic churches began what are known as Reformed churches even today in Switzerland and in Scotland, the Presbyterian Church, and the Church of England, which Dave mentioned earlier. So they all began to break out of the Catholic Church, which was a good step because they did not hold to all the things like worshiping Mary, praying to the saints, and works-based salvation. They began teaching salvation by grace, etc. But here's the biggest problem with the Protestants. When they broke out of the state-run Roman Catholic Church and formed their own churches, they began state-run churches too. And so Baptist people, Baptistic, they weren't called Baptist yet, but they were Baptistic, they were our ancestors. They were prosecuted by the Protestant churches because the Baptistic people, the New Testament Christians, would not conform to the Church of England. They would not conform to the Lutheran Church in Germany, or the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, or the Reformed Church in Switzerland. You see what I'm saying? Well, we as Baptistic people have always been against any form of state-controlled religion or church. And it's based on this key reference where Jesus said, Caesar's one thing, that means the government, and God is another thing, and that means the church. The church is one thing, the state is one thing, and they're not to come together. Now, we can move on from the Protestant churches, and I could say a lot more about that. But did you know of the 13 original colonies in America? 8 of them also had a state government-run church. New England colonies were Congregationalist or Puritan, and that was a good step away from Catholicism and the Church of England. They broke off the Church of England. But then Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Plymouth, which later became a couple of other states, they established the Congregational Church as the official state religion. And when they did that, taxpayers funded the salaries of the ministers. Now, Ken, that might not be a bad thing, for, poor humble preachers. And laws required regular church attendance. And I read one account in Virginia, the southern colonies, they became Anglican state churches. Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, they established the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, as the official state church. Public funds, that is tax money, supported church operations, and colonial officials often required public servants to be Anglican church members. In fact, in Virginia, where I pastored for a number of years after the Army, it was a state law that if you did not go to church on Sunday morning, the state militia would go find you and haul you into church or fine you. So, man, that might increase church attendance. But what would it do for the individual soul liberty? Coercion. You see the problem with it? And again, I could give you lots and lots of examples, but we as Baptist people and our bears, our forefathers and foremothers, we have traditionally, historically, always stood against any kind of merging of state power over religion, for one thing, such as Islam, but also over Christianity. Because whose form of Christianity are you going to make everybody become? Well, you're violating their individual soul liberty before God. That's why we've stood against it. I think I have separation of church and state, also called religious liberty, means there should be no official union of God's church and human government, but the government should protect the rights of the church, that's separate from the state, to practice an unholy union. There's no state church sanctioned in the New Testament. There's the state, there's the church. This was the Baptist position. James Madison, he understood what the early colonial Baptists, because they were persecuted. Our Baptist preacher forefathers, they were thrown in jail and whipped and fined and persecuted by these state churches, even in the colonies in the early days of America. So this is a position that James Madison said, the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or in any pretext infringed. Now, I don't know personally whether, I probably should know, but I don't think James Madison was a Baptist, but he understood the principle of the separation of church and state and individual soul liberty. This is where we've always stood as Baptist people. I'm going to read a paragraph. I don't know if I have this. 3 institutions. Let me come back to this because I'm going to read something else to you it was way back in 1922. That was a little over 100 years ago. The pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas, George W. Truett. You ever heard that name? I know Alex has. Anybody else ever heard? Some of you have. All right. He spoke from the steps of the United States Capitol to over 10,000 people. By the way, they didn't have any microphones or anything. He just used his preacher voice. And he spoke the following words about the Baptist belief in religious liberty. I'm going to read this paragraph to you from this sermon, okay? He said, that utterance of Jesus, render therefore unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, is one of the most revolutionary and history-making utterances that ever fell from those divine lips. That utterance, once and for all, marked the divorce of church and state. It marked a new era for the creeds and deeds of men. It was the sunrise gun of a new day, the echoes of which are to go on and on and on until in every land, whether great or small, the doctrine shall have absolute supremacy everywhere of a free church in a free state. That has always been our goal, a free church in a free state, religious liberty and the individual conscience of the soul. In behalf of our Baptist people, I am compelled to say that forgetfulness of the principles that I have just enumerated in our judgment explains many of the religious ills that now afflict the world. All went well in the early churches in their earlier days. They were incomparably triumphant days for the Christian faith. Those early disciples of Jesus, without prestige and worldly power, yet aflame with the love of God and the passion of Christ, went out and shook the pagan Roman Empire from center to circumference, even in one brief generation. Christ's religion, that is biblical Christianity, needs no prop of any kind from any worldly source, and to the degree that it is thus supported is a millstone hanged about its neck. Did you get all those words? I mean, I hope you understand what he was saying. We believe in individual soul liberty, and there should be no coercion from the government powers upon people and religious choice. when we establish this particular distinctive, we say God established 3 institutions for the good of mankind. 3 institutions God ordained for our good and for the smooth operation of the earth. Does anybody know what they are? 1, 2, 3. What was the first institution God ordained? The home. Exactly. God's centerpiece of human civilization. We experienced a little of it last Saturday at the wedding, if you were able to be here, where I read from Genesis 2, where God made Eve out of Adam's rib, made them co-equal with one another, and pronounced the first wedding ceremony in history. Man shall leave his father and mother, shall cleave unto his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That was my 3-point outline if you weren't here. Leaving, cleaving, and weaving their life together. And so that's where God first ordained the family as part of human civilization. By the way, you know why Satan attacks the home so hard these days? Because it's an institution of God. That's why Satan is going to do everything he can to destroy homes, to make children rebel against their parents, divorce and abandonment and adultery and all those sins that go on that destroy the home. Satan works on that. The second thing God established was the church. Now, he worked it through Israel, and then he ordained the church in the New Testament era, the New Testament, New Covenant people, to proclaim the gospel of Jesus, provide the spiritual welfare of his new covenant, that whosoever will call on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Now, it's not necessarily in that order, but the third one is human government. God established human government way back in the early days of creation, to establish order for mankind. And we don't have time to go into all that, but if you read Romans 13, you will see even Paul talked about how we're to obey the powers over us. And what was the situation when Paul wrote? What was the historical background and context of Romans 13 when Paul wrote those words? Be subject to the higher powers. He later said, pray for your government authorities and leaders and kings and all that are in authority. Who was in charge of government at that time? The Roman Empire. And how did they feel about Christianity? Yeah, they didn't like it at all. And we could talk, and when we get into the history, we'll give a few examples. But nonetheless, Paul said the powers that be are ordained by God. And so therefore, we are to do what we can to obey the governments that are over us. And the ideal situation is that church and government support one another, not prop up one another. The church should not control the state, and the state should not control the church. Biblically, they're 2 separate entities. However, government has a role, peace and safety, to provide stability, promote justice in a nation. And then, does the church have a responsibility to a nation? Yes, to provide a positive social order, right? Help produce law-abiding, hard-working, honest citizens, and teaching them the principles of good citizenship. That's part of the reason why we're supposed to go out and vote, y'all. That's part of our responsibility. Vote in people of faith. Vote in people with biblical values. And we may not find, 10,000 Baptists running for public office, but we can, if we look and we read the resources that are out there, we can find people that will, at a minimum, seek to uphold biblical principles, that they're men and women of goodwill. Many of them are Christian believers, maybe of other traditions, other denominations, but at least they will have a biblical foundation of who they are. And part of our responsibility is to see that this happens, a free church in a free state. Okay? Could spend a lot of time on that. Christian duties to support, pay our taxes. I know we don't like that part. I say pay what's due. Don't pay a penny more. Pay what you owe, and then don't pay any more. All right? Unless you want to. You know, well, I won't go there. Serve in the military, for some people, that's part of being a good citizen. If God allowed you to do that, if God calls you to do that, some of us in here have done that. Show respect for government officials. That's not done much anymore. You know, now even Christians, well, if they're not of my party, I'm not even going to respect their position. Well, that's not biblical. Even if we disagree with somebody that's a politician, if they're in a government office and they were fairly elected, we at least need to respect the office that they're in, right? I didn't get much of an amen on that. Civil authorities, yeah, I know. It's obey civil authority, believe and practice anything. Now, here's where the exception rule is. Because a couple of places in the Bible, it tells us we are to obey God rather than man, right? And I think I got those verses on your outline. You can look them up. When it comes to the point that we have to have a government law that would compel us to disobey the law of God, what are we supposed to do as Christians? We ought to obey God rather than man. What would be an example of that, for instance? Gary, get that mic over here. All right, stand up, use your preacher voice.
When I was pastoring a church in Barton, Vermont,
Oh, you got
the state of Vermont.
Well, we need it for the video.
All right.
There you go.
The state of Vermont declared that we had to recognize and marry 2 men or 2 women, and we didn't have a choice. Well, unless we posted it as you come in the front door of the church, that we stood against it and put scripture to back it up. State trying to control the
But
church.
if they told you you had to do it, what would be the response?
Well,
We
then
wouldn't do it.
There was a good chance that you wouldn't be recognized as a church.
And that might have been the
Yeah.
consequences for obeying God rather than man, right?
Yeah.
What if there was a law that said all women between the ages of 25 and 30, if they got pregnant, the law said they had to get an abortion because we have a population explosion? Well, we wouldn't do that, would we, as Christians? If we're the right kind of Christian, if we're biblical Christians, we wouldn't do that. If they told us that we could no longer worship together on Sunday morning or anytime, we could not have more than 3 people gather together in the name of Christianity, what would we do? Y'all know that I experienced this in a certain Middle Eastern country where it was Islamic Sharia law. And the Christians there had to make a decision. They're either not going to worship, they're not going to practice Christianity, or they're going to go underground and do it anyway because we obey God rather than men. Now, that's happened over the centuries. And our ancestors, New Testament Christians, Baptistic Christians, have paid a heavy price, and rivers of blood have been spilled because men and women of faith and trust in Jesus became martyrs for the faith because they said, we will obey God rather than men. So that's the exception clause. Any thoughts or comments on that? Okay, I'm kind of going through this quick because I'd like to finish this tonight. Christians have a responsibility to pray for guidance, protection, salvation, of people in authority. 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul said, I urge you, pray for kings and all that are in authority, that they'll come to the knowledge of the truth, that they'll, allow us to live in peace and safety. So that's part of our responsibility. A good citizen for God's glory. Now, I like what Daniel Webster said, whatever makes men good Christians makes them good citizens. And that's true. I mean, if you're living for Jesus, you're going to be a good citizen up to the point where the laws tell you got to disobey God, right? Biblical principle, scriptural idea of separation has not been achieved. The unholy union of church and state has produced mostly harm and not harmony, because it is violating people's consciences left and right. And then, of course, there's the idea, if you don't conform, there are going to be civil and legal penalties. There could be jail time. There could be torture. There could be burned at the stake, depending on, what period of history we're talking about. That's why we, as Baptist people, have always stood against this. It's part of our struggle. Church and state union is a non-biblical practice. We've consistently stood against it, and we've courageously advocated religious liberty. And by the way, it's mainly due to Baptist and other like-minded individuals who believe similarly to what we as Baptists believe, what our Baptist forefathers believe. That's why there is no state-operated church in America today, because of our Baptist forefathers. And they were very influential in this. When I say we do not believe that God himself must be left out of government, we believe that Christians be allowed to freely practice and proclaim, which will have the ultimate effect of God being present in the nation at all levels, including government. So that's what we want. We're not talking about, and that's what a lot of liberals and socialists, that's what they try to teach and misconstrue what separation of church and state is. They try to portray it as the separation of God and state, that the government should have nothing to do with any form of religion whatsoever, and government officials should never talk about God, should never talk about their faith. That's not separation of church and state. Separation of church and state is every individual should be able to freely express what they believe when it comes to spiritual and religious matters. So, blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord. Neither church nor state should seek to exert control over the other. And here's part of that utterance of Jesus, render to Caesar what Caesar's, most extraordinary and revolutionary history-making utterances that ever fell from those divine lips. Mark the divorce of church and state. All right, I kind of rushed through that, so I want to make sure that you don't have any questions, and then I'm going to go over a couple of things and give you a handout to kind of synopsize everything. Does anybody have any question? Do we understand why we believe in the separation of church and state as Baptist believers? Do you have any questions that we need to clarify? Okay? Did I do a good job of explaining it? Either that or you weren't listening. All right, I want everybody to take a copy. Don't read it now, but I want to go through a couple of things about some of the misunderstandings and how we need to address this. And you'll have it right here in your hand, front and back. On the back side, there's a section called Common Misperceptions about Baptists and the separation of church and state. Because you may have people that you talk to, maybe family members, maybe friends, that maybe don't understand this. Because there is I will tell you, and we have to be careful of this, there is a strand of conservative Christianity that thinks Christianity should take over the U.S. government and proclaim Christianity as the law of the land. That's pretty extreme, but there is a thread of Christianity that does that. Put those on the table, would you, Jim? You can take, there's a few more if you want to take some and give them to somebody, but I want you to look at the backside for a minute, and this is kind of the way we'll wrap this up tonight. Common misperceptions. When you talk with others, some people may ask these questions or have these ideas. Here's the first one. See, misconception number one, separation of church and state means removing God or Christians from the public square. Well, that's what a lot of people think it means. That's what liberals want to try to make it mean. You should never have any mention of God in the public life of the nation. Yeah, I know. Kick God out, kick Bible reading out. Well, notice the reality. Historic Baptists never wanted a secularized society void of Christian influence. They believe Christians should actively vote and preach and evangelize and have public discussions about their convictions. That's what a free church and a free state, that's what we want. No, freedom of speech, that's right, LC. And notice the distinction. Separation means keeping the institution of government out of the institution of the church and vice versa. It prevents the state from choosing pastors, writing prayers, or funding ministries with tax dollars. By the way, this is another challenge. Christian schools, ministries, sometimes they'll have a weak moment and they will see a particular program that says you can have some tax money to help you with your ministry. And sometimes they eagerly gobble it up. But then on the back end, they find out, oh, you took tax money. Now, therefore, you must do A, B, and C in your Christian school or your Christian ministry. You understand what I'm talking about? That's why we have to be very careful. In COVID, this was a big deal. Now, I don't think there's been a lot of repercussions with that because everything was topsy-turvy then. But I have known of Christian schools and ministries, there's been a few, who took taxpayer money and then they were caught up in the web of taxpayer and government regulations that violated if you take tax money, you have to admit homosexuals into your school, even though they're against your religious conviction, because taxpayer money is helping you. That's one example. See what I'm talking about? All right, misconception number two. The wall of separation is a modern secular concept designed to attack religion. Now, you've heard that term, the wall of separation between church and state. Well, that was originally, actually before Thomas Jefferson. It goes all the way back to Roger Williams. Have you ever heard of Roger Williams? Not the singer. I knew somebody was going to say that. Roger Williams was and again, I'm pushing some things off to our history discussion in a couple of weeks. Roger Williams was the one who founded the Rhode Island colony. And what was unique about the Rhode Island colony? He was a Baptist, by the way. Freedom of religion for everyone. It was the only state of the 13 original colonies that had that as its foundational principle, is religious freedom. Roger Williams, he was a Baptist. Now, he backslid a little bit later in life and became something else, but when he did that, he was a firm Baptist Christian. But notice, wall of separation was actually coined by Christians, not secular humanists. Baptist pioneer Roger Williams first wrote about a hedge or wall of separation in 1644 to protect the garden of the church from the wilderness of the church, of the world. Thomas Jefferson later used the phrase in his famous 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptist Association to reassure them that the government would never interfere with the church's liberties. There's a lot of deep, rich history we have as Baptist Christians. How about this one, number 3? Early Christian colonies were always beacons of religious freedom. Most early American colonies actually had state-enforced churches and heavily persecuted religious minorities, especially our Baptist people. Quakers also, and there were other, non-conformists. The history in Virginia, Massachusetts, Baptists were routinely fined, beaten, and jailed just for preaching without a government license. It was the relentless activism of early Baptists working alongside figures like James Madison, we had his quote up there, that forced the young United States to adopt the First Amendment and abandon any kind of state-established church. So you know what I want to say? Yay, Baptist. We got it right. Our forefathers and foremothers got it right. Pat?
James Madison was actually a Puritan.
Okay, well, he was close.
So he was
Congregational.
raised in,
Okay, good.
He was raised in that Anglican. I'm sorry. He was
Anglican?
He was
Okay.
raised in that
Church of England.
and baptized in.
Yeah, so much, again, it was the state church of the southern colonies. So that makes sense because he was from Virginia. And then misconception number 4, if the government endorses Christianity, it will help the church grow and stay pure. Reality, history shows that whenever the government partners with or sponsors the church loses its spiritual power and becomes corrupt. Prime example, the Roman Catholic Church. When Constantine made Catholicism, or Christianity rather, the state religion of the Roman Empire and said, everybody is now a Christian. What in the world did that do to individual soul liberty? It destroyed it. And I think we understand that. When the state funds or favors a church, the state eventually demands the right to control it. You took tax money, we're paying your preacher, so you're going to do what we say. And of course, as sin becomes worse and worse, it's obviously going to get worse in that kind of situation. Political power compromises the gospel message, turning church membership into a tool for political gain rather than a genuine heart-led response to Jesus Christ. And by the way, that's why most state-sponsored churches historically have required infant baptism. You make that baby a member of the Anglican church or the Puritan church or the Congregational church as soon as they're able to, get out of the womb. And that way they are lifelong adherents. Whether they ever find salvation in Jesus Christ, they're still a member of the such and such a church. You see why we're against it? You see why the Bible stands against church and state being united together? All right, again, when we look at the history, we'll talk a little more about the formation of the Catholic Church and some of those Protestant Reformed churches. And by the way, we'll try to explain when we get there, historically, and I know there's a lot of pushback on this, especially today, I do not believe Baptists are Protestants. We're lumped in with them, and Southern Baptist Convention is called, America's largest Protestant denomination. We're not Protestant historically, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. So we have a few more weeks. We'll wrap up the history, and I hope you'll plan to be here and be part of that. We'll talk about our distinguished heritage. How do we trace that? And what can we learn from it? So that's where we are, Baptists. Baptists. I don't know. Can't get a tune in my head to do it. But any final questions, comments, criticisms, alibis? Anybody want to share anything else before we close tonight? All right, I know I went through this pretty quick, but I did want to try to finish this so we could move into our history and start our new Bible study, 1st of October. And it looks like now it's going to be on the spiritual gifts unless we get a mass, and don't anybody stuff the ballot box, okay? Unless we get a massive input for either Ruth or ask the pastor questions again. All right, there we are. Hey, thanks for coming tonight. Glad you came and participated. Hope you learned something, and hope you sense the presence of the Lord here in our Bible study. All right, let's stand together. We'll have a word of prayer, share the love with somebody before you leave tonight, and hopefully we'll see you on the Lord's Day. So, Father, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for allowing us to learn some things about, we've got a really rich heritage as Baptist believers. And we need to know that. It's not something that makes us proud, Lord, but it is something that makes us grateful. And so we appreciate all those generations who have led up to now, and that we can carry on New Testament Christianity into the 21st century. Thank you for giving us that privilege. Now be with us as we go from here. Bless those that have come, those that wanted to come and couldn't come tonight. Bless them as well. And then help us on the Lord's Day to continue to sense your presence. In Jesus' name, amen and amen. All right, thanks for stopping by.